Hello and welcome. You're watching Hot Pursuit. Very rarely does industry say it like it is. I'm joined today in Hot Pursuit by the President of CII, Mr. Godrej. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking with Headlines today. Sir, Standard & Poor's has recently cut India's outlook to negative from stable, and they're talking about the slow pace of fiscal consolidation, the worsening external sector situation, inflationary pressures, slow pace of economic growth, very close to taking India to a junk status. Is this really reality as you see it, or is there more concern than reality?
Well, it's always a concern when a rating agency looks at the country's economy negatively, and I think we should try and overcome that. So CII for this year has decided on a theme on reviving growth through reforms and governance. Very clearly, GDP growth rates have decelerated. Industry growth rates have also decelerated. The good news is there's a lot we could do to try and reverse this situation. We need to get the momentum going, we need to get reforms going, and we need to get improvements in governance going. The two together could be very positive for the Indian economy.
But the Prime Minister, sir, has blamed Indian industry for dampening sentiment by making doomsday prophecies. He told industry that the reality is not as bad as you make it seem. India is still one of the fastest growing economies in the world. The Prime Minister accuses the Indian industry of dampening spirit, saying nasty things. He believes things aren't as bad as all of you make it seem.
Well, I agree. I agree that the perception is worse than the reality. When we met the Prime Minister, when our new team took over, we met the Prime Minister and we clearly said the perception is worse than reality. And partly it's so because everybody gets a little depressed when things are not going as well as they were the previous year and considers that a negative. But at the same time, government is making moves which creates a negative perception. So we suggested to the Prime Minister that both industry and government should work to ensure that the perception gets better, but at the same time we need to work to see that the reality gets better too.
While the government says they would like to improve perception, then you see the Finance Minister go and introduce retrospective taxation, which completely seems to have freaked investors out. We were at a gathering yesterday speaking to a lot of foreign investors. They're very, very concerned, and a lot of them are fleeing with their money out of India. Is that of concern to you?
Yes, of course. We have told the government that these suggestions on GAR and retrospective amendments has created a negative perception. We have mentioned to them that it needs to be overcome. It's a very bad time for such negative perceptions to be created when things are bad as it is. So we have clearly mentioned this, and I think it's clearly been taken on board. I think most people, both in India and internationally, have given this feedback to the government.
But that doesn't seem to have changed much, and this is also the sort of decision that the government would have known what the ramifications of it would have been. Despite that, the Finance Minister does it. Do you believe this was done out of spite? That because we lost a case in the Supreme Court, now the government wants to get back at industry, show who's boss, and do something which makes India, frankly, the laughingstock internationally?
Well, it's very difficult to ascribe intentions to anything, but clearly it has created a negative perception on India, and we need to overcome that. So there have been discussions, for example, on GAR and how to ensure that the provisions are changed adequately. And I think there are a lot of discussions on the retrospective amendments going on, and I do hope the government will see their way to make these amendments prospective as far as possible.
Do you think over the last few months there's been a greater trust deficit between corporates and with government? Because of the actions of the government, because of its inactions on the reform front, is the trust deficit between government and corporates wide?
No, I don't think there is a change in the trust deficit. What has changed is in the perceptions. Obviously, if reforms are slowed down, obviously if certain reforms are announced and then withdrawn, obviously if there are political difficulties within the ruling partners, that does create a negative impression. I don't think the trust deficit has changed. I think we in CII would like to work very closely with the government, not just with the government, with the state governments, with the opposition, to see that we are able to reverse this process. It makes no sense for us to be just critical. I believe in suggesting improvements rather than merely criticizing.
But the government too, sir, now seems to be giving up. We saw the Prime Minister's economic advisor Kaushik Basu say that between now and 2014 reforms are unlikely because of the political compulsions that face this current government. People within the government seem to be giving up.
That's what was reported in the media, but he contradicted that. He didn't say that at all, and he felt that in the next 6 months he sees a considerable number of reforms being taken forward.
But he did say it originally. Later he said that's not quite what he meant. But given the fact that every single reform measure of this government has been torpedoed from within, more often than not, most probably by the Trinamool Congress, are you at all hopeful that the government will actually deliver on any of the key reforms that corporate India and all of India is actually looking out for?
I think they can. They perhaps need to change their approach a little bit. For example, the biggest single reform which can transform the economic situation in India is the passage of the goods and services tax. That one reform alone will add 1.5 to 2 percentage points to India's GDP growth, other things being equal. It will help solve many of our macroeconomic issues such as fiscal deficit, inflation. It's a great reform. I think it's getting into momentum. CII has worked very strongly with the states who were opposing it. We've been working with the empowered committee. We've been working with the government. The finance minister also mentioned when he came to the CII annual meeting that there is progress, and he thanks CII for its effort. It's up to us to ensure that very important reforms such as this, which may have some divisiveness problems, are resolved, and CII has great access to all concerned.
No, but I interviewed the finance minister. I posed this question to him. He says, you can't hold timelines against my head when it is state governments that are stalling this reform. The BJP, which earlier mooted this and backed this, has now had a change of heart. They're now creating obstacles. He says, don't blame me, I don't have the numbers, and the current situation is a consequence of the mandate, the fractured mandate that the people gave me.
Rahul, in democratic politics, if you talk to politicians, whether they're in government or outside government, clearly one of their ways of running their political system is to criticize the opposition, whoever they are. The government criticizes the opposition criticizes the government. That is to be expected. It's up to responsible bodies like CII, to whom economic growth is extremely important, to whose members economic growth is very important, to try and see how they can resolve some of these issues, and we've been able to do a very good job of it. Secondly, we are not relying only on reforms and growth for progress in the country. So for example, we've had a session with our members where we say innovation, continuous improvement is what we should pay more attention to. So no matter what the external environment is, companies can do even better. It's very important to do that. We are benchmarking some of the things states have been doing. There are some states in India which are growing at 10% plus. There are some states in which agriculture is growing 10% plus. So if we always look at the negative, if we always look at what is not going well and avoid looking at what is going well and how that could be leveraged to advantage, I think our progress will be less than it could be.
But do you think this government has lost its will to reform? The will now seems to have gone out of the government, because even if you look at the recent reports, they're saying that the Prime Minister is now an aging technocrat who doesn't have the stomach for the rough and tumble of Indian politics. Is that really a fair summary of the Prime Minister and this government?
Well, it's not up to me to decide that. I don't know what the thinking within the government is or what the thinking within individual
But how do you see it?
Is. No, the way I see it is CII can play a very strong role in encouraging reform, in encouraging strong steps in governance and transparency to provide for faster growth, and that's what we will attempt to. We don't want to judge anybody. What we want to do is to provide improvement, provide suggestions for improvement, provide suggestions so that India's economy gets back on track.
You know, in the recent Moody's analytics report, the Congress first family, the Gandhis, have also come in for criticism, and they are blamed for failing to restart the legislative process for reforms. and they're also accused of blowing their party's chance in the recent state elections, including Uttar Pradesh. Do you think, as the Prime Minister and the government takes a lot of the blame for stalling reform and for sleeping at the wheel, as it were, the Gandhis too take a large part of the blame?
Well, first of all, I don't have expertise in the field, so I would like to comment on that part. But I would like to comment on one thing. What is very refreshing is that of late, if you look at the elections in this country over the last 3 to 5 years, most state governments, central governments, which have provided good reform, good growth, and have their agenda for further growth and reform, have been elected or re-elected. That's a good trend. Earlier we had a trend where parochial politics got people elected, caste politics got people elected. I am very happy to see that developmental stress is getting parties elected, and that is a good direction. Now, I'm sure all the politicians in all the parties will take this on board and will therefore make greater stress on developmental economics rather than just handouts at the time of election.
One of the other things we've seen recently is the fact that there's now a lot of pressure on the government to perform. But Indian industry, over the last few months, has been making massive investments abroad. Is that really a vote of no confidence in the Indian investment climate? Is that a vote of no confidence in the government of the day? We'll ask that question to Mr. Godrej when we return on the other side of a quick break. Stay tuned to Hot Pursuit. You're watching Hot Pursuit. The Tatas, the Birlas, the Ambanis, all of India's biggest groups are really voting with their money, and they're voting against this government taking the money out. Is that, sir, at some level because of the depressing investment climate here and how many regulatory problems corporates are having to deal with?
I wouldn't agree with you. There's a lot of investment being made by Indian companies outside. Our group is also investing very strongly outside. But to my mind, this is clearly not instead of investing in India, but in addition to investing in India. Indian companies are getting to great scale, size and competitiveness. This is the time when they can expand globally. Global expansion allows companies to derive great synergistic benefits. And when you become a multinational, there are many other advantages you get. So I think it's very clearly in addition to investing in India. Now, investment in India will of course depend on how the demand is, what is the cost of the investment. So we need to encourage people to invest in India even more than they are doing now.
But given the fact that rules can change several years after they're made, we've seen that happen recently. Given the regulatory problems companies are having, a lot of industrialists we've been speaking to say it's simply not worth it. The same sort of money with much lesser effort can give us much greater returns in Africa, elsewhere. Why make that effort in India? And this is the sense that Indian industrialists are increasingly exuding.
No, I would say that when there is demand to be met in India, and many companies very clearly don't want to lose their market share or growth in India, when there is investment to be, it will very well be made. The point is, yes, the investment climate should not be negative. Perceptions should not get bad. And I agree with you that this whole thing on GAR and retrospective amendments is not in our interest. I feel it is.
Do you think the current perception and the current investment climate, will you be as blunt as to say because of what the government has done, the investment climate in this country, sir, has turned negative?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think we should make sure that it doesn't. Unfortunately, the perception has been spoilt in the last month after the budget was presented. The budget has many good provisions, excellent provisions, which have got totally lost in the discussion on the retrospective amendments, which to my mind has created a very bad perception.
But what does it tell you about the mental makeup of a government that despite knowing the consequences announces such a decision?
No, but it's up to us to point it out. Governments do make mistakes, governments do take wrong steps. It's up to us to point that out and try and change that.
Do you think this government, sir, has passed its use-by date? Do you think it will be better for corporate India and for the country maybe if there is a new government with the will and the intent and the determination to push forward the growth
Rahul,
story?
I don't want to make political comments. Your question is a political question. I'm more concerned that CII helps the government of India, not just the central government, the state governments, the opposition parties, We must get them together so that India's economic program goes forward.
You know, the moment you say that, the government then, sir, accuses the BJP at the centre as the principal opposition party of playing a highly obstructionist role. They say whether it is FDI in retail, whether it is opening up aviation, pension, any reform that they wish to do, it is the opposition that stalls it. Now, do you think that in this entire argument and discussion, the opposition too needs to play a more supportive role?
Rahul, this is the way of politics in democratic countries. If you see, a similar thing is happening in the United States. The Democrats blame the Republicans say the Democrats haven't got it right. This is part of the price you pay for a democracy. Now, it is important for a body like CII to try and resolve some of these issues, because we are given a hearing by both sides. We are able to impress upon them what is important, what needs to be done, what needs to be taken ahead, and that's what we will concentrate on. Instead of being critical, to my mind, being critical in any form of life, whether it's in a family or in a business, criticism by itself does not solve problems. Suggesting improvements which are good, suggesting ways of getting around problems works. And that's what CII will devote itself to.
You know, we've seen a very interesting move over the last few weeks. Some top industrialists have actually been lobbying with chief ministers on behalf of Mr. Narendra Modi to try and win support for him. Do you think it in some level reflects the desire that a large part of corporate India has to see change, political change, which is what is leading these industrialists who are not really prone to political lobbying otherwise to try and lobby on the behalf of an individual?
Well, I'm not aware of such a move, and I'm sure people have their preferences in who they would, and I'm sure there would be some lobbying. I'm sure there are people who express their preferences. That's only natural in a democracy.
Because this is a question that is a very pressing question at this time. Corporate India's preference for Narendra Modi as the next Prime Minister. Would you back such a move? I want to know from you.
I think there are many good leaders in India. There are many states that are being led very well. Ultimately, it's the people who have to decide. But CII's role should not be partisan. CII's role should be very clearly pointing out what can be done in terms of reform and governance and how we take that ahead and getting the disparate polity together.
You're saying that CII wants to make suggestions, wants to encourage the government on the road to reform, but do you at all, given the government's track record, and I want to go back once again to what Kaushik Basu said, he says because of all these, the spate of recent corruption scams, the bureaucracy now doesn't want to take any risk. They're completely risk averse. Given this current situation, do you actually see hope that any of your suggestions will actually see the light of day?
Well, that is very clearly one of the problems. Very clearly, if the bureaucracy has seen a major issue on governance taking place, they are worried. Sometimes not taking a decision is found to be safer than taking a good decision. So we must overcome that. We have suggested to government that first of all, government should improve the whole governance situation by getting out of the way in many cases. Secondly, whatever little interaction that is a must between business and citizens and the government should be e-enabled as far as possible. And third, time limits should be set. Not time limits by which they give an excuse as to why something is not done. Time limits within which they must get the additional information they need and get the case dealt with. And some states have been doing a very good job on it. So it's our job to benchmark these practices that are working in India and translate it to other places. At the same time, we want to benchmark the best practices in the country and want the other states to follow them. For example, Rahul, I don't know if you are aware, if our agricultural output in each crop is merely increased to the best level in India, I'm not even talking of the best level in the world, we could double our agricultural output. And there are many states which are doing a good job in this. We can benchmark other states to follow it. First, they get a little resistant because they say, oh no, we know how to do things. But when we give them very good ideas, when we give them very good suggestions, they're thankful for it. So our job is to be positive about things. Our job is to change the way we do things in many cases, whether it's in reform or governance, and ensure that high rate of growth is restored. Fortunately, there are many tools we have. We are not like some countries in Europe, etc. We don't know which way to turn because it's very difficult to get things going. We have many tools, we have many solutions. It's a question of working with all concerned to put them through.
But do you think the government's impulse is becoming more and more socialist? You know, it's a throwback to the days of the 70s where everything the government seems to want to do requires spending a lot of money which they don't necessarily know where they'll get from, and appeasing people in the hope that they will vote for them. So you spoke about problems of countries in Europe. Do you have a fear that India too, because of the current situation, might be headed in that direction?
Well, clearly there are some elements in the country who might want to head in that direction. We are very clear. Our message is free enterprise is extremely important. I don't even like to use the word capitalism. I like to use the word free enterprise, which encourages entrepreneurship. India has gained tremendously out of entrepreneurship. India has gained tremendously out of reforms which have added to free enterprise in the country. And even the governance issue, some people tend to feel that the lack of governance, lack of transparency issue should be countered with more government. We are totally against it. We think it should be done with less government. We think it should be extremely transparent, everything in government. Minimum of case by case way of running government, whether it's in the center or the states. And another great emphasis we want to put on is India's economy, to a large extent, is in the states. It is manifested in the states. And so a lot of the work that can be done in the states, and CII has 64 offices across the country. We are in every state of the country. Even the Northeast is very well covered. So we can work very strongly with the states to take the reform agenda.
Now, as I come to the concluding part of this interview, at a book launch recently, a whole bunch of economists actually told the Prime Minister that, sir, your legacy is now at risk. If the Prime Minister were watching this broadcast, what is it, sir, that as CII President you'd like to tell him to ensure that the India growth story, which he's played such a great part in, make happen and bring India to where it is, doesn't get frittered away by the inactions of this government?
You know, my message would be, so let's get the reform program going. Let's ensure that neither the government nor industry does anything where the perception becomes worse than the reality. Let's improve the reality. Let's get going both on the reform and governance platforms, and let's restore the 9% rate of growth, which to my mind is India's birthright.
And do you believe that's doable? Do you believe that this government has the mettle and the ability to get that done?
Yes, I think with the right approaches, we could bring about changes.
Mr. Godrej for speaking to us on Hot Pursuit. Thank you very much.
Very good talking to you, Rahul.